The wild has its own unforgiving rules, where the weak perish and the strong endure. In the wild expanse of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, a hunter by trade, a loner by choice, he understood the silent language of the wilderness. Jack Morrison knew the forest like the back of his hand. But when the snow fell heavier than usual and the wind howled through the pines, nature delivered a gift that would change his life forever. Nothing in his decades of experience prepared him for what he found that day. A half-dead bobcat, frozen and on the brink of death, lay trapped in the ice. A fleeting moment of mercy in a world governed by the harshest survival rules. Jack's instinct told him to end its suffering. Out here, mercy is a rare thing. The choice should have been simple. But something in the creature's dimly flickering eyes stopped him cold. What happens when a man, hardened by years of solitude, is forced to make a decision that defies nature's law? This is a tale of second chances, silent bonds, and the delicate balance between human intervention and the raw power of nature. One man, one wild creature, and a decision that would shape the future.
The November wind whistled through the pines of northern Michigan's Upper Peninsula, carrying the first serious snow of the season. Jack Morrison pulled his worn wool cap lower over his graying hair and tightened the collar of his hunting jacket. At 53, the cold settled in his bones more deeply than it had in his youth, but the forest still called to him with the same insistent voice he'd first heard as a boy. He checked his rifle and adjusted his pack, the familiar way to comfort as he trudged through the fresh powder. The weak morning light filtered through bare branches, casting long shadows across the pristine white landscape. Jack had been hunting these woods for over 4 decades, ever since his father first brought him here at 12 years old. Now the forest felt more like home than the empty cabin he returned to each night. Should have been here yesterday, he muttered to himself, studying the fresh deer tracks that crisscrossed the snow. Storm drove them down from the highlands. Jack knew these woods intimately, every ridge, every valley, every seasonal creek. He'd spent so many years here that his ex-wife, Caroline, used to joke that he had pine sap in his veins instead of blood. The joke had stopped being funny about 8 years ago, right before she'd packed her bags and moved back to Chicago, taking their son Mark with her. He couldn't blame her. Jack had always been more comfortable with the silence of the trees than with the noise of human companionship. The forest made sense to him in a way that people rarely did. Out here, life followed predictable patterns. Animals behaved according to instinct and necessity. The rules never changed. Jack paused to catch his breath, leaning against the rough bark of an ancient oak. 20 years ago, he wouldn't have needed to rest on this familiar trail. Another reminder that time was passing, changing him even as the forest remained eternal. He'd promised to call Mark tonight. His son was 19 now, a sophomore at Michigan State studying environmental science. Jack felt a surge of pride thinking about the boy. Despite everything, the divorce, the distance, Jack's own failings as a father, Mark had grown into a thoughtful young man with a love for the natural world that mirrored Jack's own. "At least I did something right," Jack murmured, pushing away from the tree and continuing along the ridge. The morning passed slowly as Jack tracked a promising buck through the woods. The animal was clever, doubling back on its trail and crossing rocky outcroppings where its scent would be harder to follow. By early afternoon, heavy clouds had rolled in, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Jack checked his watch and made the reluctant decision to head back. The buck would have to wait for another day. Taking a shortcut back to his cabin meant crossing Timber Creek. In the summer, it was a lazy, shallow stream that barely reached mid-calf, but winter transformed it into a treacherous stretch of ice. Still, Jack had crossed it countless times over the years. He knew where the ice was thickest, which areas to avoid, and how to test its strength before committing his weight. As he approached the creek, Jack noticed something unusual on the surface of the ice about 30 yards downstream. At first, he thought it might be debris, perhaps a fallen branch partially submerged in the frozen water. But as he drew closer, he realized it was an animal. "What the hell?" Jack muttered, changing course to investigate. The creature was a bobcat, young by the looks of it, though it was hard to tell with its tawny fur matted with ice and snow. The animal appeared to have broken through thin ice while attempting to cross, then become trapped as the water refroze around it. Only its head and part of its upper body remained above the surface, and even those were dusted with fresh snow. Its eyes were closed, and it showed no signs of movement. Jack approached cautiously. Bobcats were relatively common in these woods, though they typically avoided humans. He'd glimpsed them occasionally over the years, tawny ghosts slipping silently between trees or perched on rocky outcroppings. They were beautiful, efficient predators, perfectly adapted to survive the harsh northern Michigan winters. Except this one hadn't. Jack knelt at the edge of the ice, studying the animal. It was smaller than most adult bobcats he'd seen, probably not more than a year old. Its breathing was shallow and irregular, visible only in the faintest plumes of vapor from its nostrils. It was dying, if not already beyond saving. "Should just put you out of your misery," Jack said quietly, hand moving to the hunting knife at his belt. It would be the merciful thing to do. The animal was suffering, and even if he somehow managed to free it from the ice, its chances of survival were slim. A quick, clean cut across the throat would end its pain. Nature was cruel that way, indifferent to suffering, concerned only with the endless cycle of life and death. Jack unsheathed his knife, the blade glinting dully in the fading afternoon light. The bobcat's eye cracked open, just a sliver of yellow-green against its frozen fur. It made no sound, no movement beyond that single, weary blink. But in that moment, something passed between them, a recognition that transcended the usual boundaries between predator and prey, human and wild thing. Jack hesitated, knife hovering in the cold air. "Damn it all," he muttered, returning the blade to its sheath. "Caroline always said I was a sentimental old fool." Decision made, Jack tested the ice carefully before venturing further out onto the creek. Using the blunt end of his hunting knife, he began to chip away at the frozen surface around the bobcat's body. The ice was several inches thick in places, and progress was slow. His fingers grew numb despite his heavy gloves, and sweat froze on his forehead and the back of his neck. After 20 minutes of laborious chipping and breaking, Jack had created a channel in the ice around the bobcat. Its body was still partially submerged in the frigid water, but at least it was no longer trapped. Carefully, Jack slid his hands beneath the animal's torso and lifted. The bobcat was heavier than it looked, its waterlogged fur adding to its weight. It didn't resist as Jack lifted it from the broken ice, which he took as a bad sign. Wild animals, particularly predators like bobcats, typically fought against human handling, even when injured. The fact that this one remained limp in his arms suggested it was much closer to death than he'd initially thought. "Hang in there, little fellow," Jack murmured, cradling the freezing animal against his chest. "Let's get you somewhere warm." The walk back to Jack's cabin took nearly an hour, made more difficult by the additional weight and the need to move carefully to avoid jostling the injured animal. By the time the small log structure came into view, twilight was settling over the forest, and the temperature had dropped further. Jack's breath came in great white plumes, and even through his layers of clothing, the cold had seeped into his bones. The cabin was dark and cold when Jack shouldered open the door. He gently laid the bobcat on the braided rug in front of the stone fireplace before quickly setting about building a fire. His fingers were stiff and clumsy with cold, but years of practice allowed him to stack kindling and logs efficiently. Within minutes, flames were licking at the dry wood, casting flickering orange light across the cabin's single room. Only then did Jack turn his attention back to the bobcat. In the firelight, he could see that the animal was young, probably born the previous spring. Its fur was matted with ice and creek water, and its breathing remained shallow and irregular. Its eyes were closed again, and it showed no reaction to the growing warmth of the fire. Jack removed his gloves and coat, hanging them on pegs near the door, then knelt beside the injured animal. Treating wounded wildlife wasn't something he had much experience with. As a hunter, he was more accustomed to ending an animal's suffering quickly and cleanly than prolonging its life. But something about the bobcat, its youth, perhaps, or that moment of connection by the frozen creek, had stirred a protective instinct in him that he couldn't easily dismiss. First things first, he muttered, retrieving a worn flannel blanket from his bed. Got to get you dry and warm. Carefully, Jack began to towel the ice and water from the bobcat's fur, mindful of potential injuries. The animal remained unresponsive, save for the shallow rise and fall of its ribcage. Once he'd removed as much moisture as possible, Jack wrapped the bobcat loosely in the blanket and positioned it closer to the fire. His father had once told him about an old trapper's remedy for animals suffering from extreme cold, a mixture of vodka, salt, and cayenne pepper. Jack had never tried it himself, but desperate circumstances called for unconventional solutions. He rummaged through his small kitchen area, retrieving a bottle of cheap vodka he kept for the occasional evening when memories grew too heavy, along with salt and an ancient container of cayenne. The mixture looked unappealing even to his untrained eye, but Jack managed to part the bobcat's jaw slightly and trickle a small amount onto its tongue. The animal reflexively swallowed but otherwise showed no reaction. "That's about all I can do for now," Jack said, settling onto the floor beside the wrapped bobcat. "Rest of it's up to you." As the cabin gradually warmed, Jack found himself talking to the unconscious animal. It had been a long time since he'd spoken more than a few words aloud to anyone besides Mark during their infrequent phone calls. The sound of his own voice felt strange in the usually quiet cabin. "Should have called you something other than Bobcat," he mused, adding another log to the fire. "Mark would have a name for you already. Boys always had a soft spot for animals." Jack thought for a moment, studying the still form beside him. "River," he decided finally, "since that's where I found you. Seems appropriate enough." The bobcat, River, didn't acknowledge the naming, but Jack felt better for having done it. It made the animal less of a stranger, created a connection between them that went beyond rescuer and rescued. As the evening deepened into night, Jack prepared a simple dinner of canned stew heated on the wood stove. He ate mechanically, his attention focused on River's breathing, which seemed slightly stronger than before. Occasionally, the bobcat's paws would twitch, as though it were running in its dreams. "Chasing rabbits?" Jack asked with a small smile. "That's a good sign, I think." After dinner, Jack remembered his promise to call Mark. He reached for the satellite phone he kept for emergencies and family calls, one of his few concessions to modern technology. The cabin had no electricity or running water, just a wood stove for heat and cooking, a hand pump for water, and an outhouse about 30 yards behind the main structure. Jack preferred it that way. Simplicity suited him. Mark answered on the third ring, his voice bringing a familiar warmth to Jack's chest. "Dad, I was just thinking about you. How's the hunting?" "Can't complain," Jack replied, settling into his worn armchair. "Tracked a nice buck today, but he gave me the slip." "How are your classes going?" They talked for nearly half an hour, longer than their usual calls. Mark told him about his environmental policy class and a research project he was working on involving forest management practices. Jack listened more than he spoke, pride swelling in his chest at his son's enthusiasm and knowledge. "Oh, I meant to tell you," Mark said eventually. "Mom said it's okay if I spend part of winter break with you this year. I'd come up around the 20th and stay through Christmas, if that works for you." Jack's heart skipped a beat. Mark hadn't spent Christmas at the cabin since before the divorce. "Of course it works," he said, trying to keep his voice even. "I'd like that very much." "Great. I've missed the woods." "And you?" Of course, Mark added with a laugh that reminded Jack powerfully of Caroline in happier times. Missed you too, son, Jack replied, his throat suddenly tight. Actually, I've got something interesting to tell you. He explained about finding River, describing the rescue and his makeshift attempts at nursing the Bobcat back to health. Mark's excitement was palpable even through the phone. That's amazing, Dad. Bobcats are incredibly resilient. If it survived being frozen in the creek, it's got a fighting chance. Are you going to call a wildlife rehabilitator? Jack glanced at River, still wrapped in the blanket by the fire. Nearest one's about 3 hours away, and with the weather turning, I'm not sure it's a good idea to move him yet. Thought I'd see how he does overnight, then decide in the morning. Makes sense. Just be careful. Even a young, injured bobcat can be dangerous. They've got wicked claws. I'll keep that in mind, Jack promised. Talk to you soon. After hanging up, Jack checked on River again. The bobcat's breathing seemed stronger, more regular, and when Jack gently parted the blanket to examine him, he noticed the animal's fur was drying nicely. There were no obvious external injuries, which was promising. Mark's looking forward to meeting you, Jack told the unconscious bobcat. If you stick around that long. He fashioned a makeshift bed on the floor near the fire, not wanting to leave River alone during the night. As he drifted off to sleep, Jack found himself hoping, with surprising intensity, that the bobcat would survive until morning. Jack woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar sensation of sleeping on the floor. Early morning light filtered through the cabin's small windows, and the fire had burned down to glowing embers. The events of the previous day came rushing back, and he turned quickly to check on River. The blanket lay empty on the braided rug. Jack sat up, scanning the cabin anxiously. Had the bobcat died during the night, or had it somehow managed to escape? The door was still closed, and the windows were secured against the winter cold. A soft sound from the kitchen area drew his attention. River was crouched beneath the small wooden table, yellow-green eyes fixed warily on Jack. The bobcat looked remarkably improved. Its fur had dried into the familiar tawny pattern marked with dark spots and streaks, and though it still seemed weak, it was obviously alert and mobile. Well, good morning to you too, Jack said quietly, keeping his movements slow and deliberate as he sat up. Feeling better, I see. River watched him intently, but made no move to flee or attack. Jack took that as a positive sign. He slowly got to his feet, wincing at the stiffness in his back and knees, and moved to the wood stove to rebuild the fire. All the while, he kept his movements measured and predictable, narrating his actions in a calm, even voice. Just getting the fire going again. Nothing to worry about. Then I'll see about finding something for both of us to eat. Once the fire was crackling in the wood stove, Jack turned his attention to breakfast. His options for feeding a bobcat were limited, but he had some jerky and a package of bacon that might appeal to the carnivore. He placed a small amount of each on a shallow dish and set it on the floor about halfway between himself and River. Not exactly a gourmet meal, but it should help get your strength back. Jack prepared his own breakfast, coffee and oatmeal, and sat at the table, deliberately avoiding staring at the bobcat. From the corner of his eye, he saw River cautiously approach the offered food, sniff it tentatively, then begin to eat. The animal moved stiffly, clearly still recovering from its ordeal, but with each passing minute, it seemed to grow stronger. The way I see it, Jack said conversationally as he sipped his coffee, you've got 3 options. 1, you can stay here until you're fully recovered, then head back to the woods. 2, I can try to get you to a wildlife rehabilitator who might be better equipped to care for you. Or 3, you can take your chances and leave now. River, unsurprisingly, offered no opinion on these options, but the bobcat did finish the food Jack had provided before retreating to a spot near the wood stove. There, it began methodically grooming itself, tongue rasping over fur that still bore traces of its icy imprisonment. I'll take that as a vote for option 1, Jack said with a small smile. The day passed quietly. Jack needed to check his traps and hunting blinds, but he was reluctant to leave River alone in the cabin. Instead, he occupied himself with indoor chores, mending a torn shirt, organizing his hunting gear, and preparing a venison stew that would last several days. Throughout it all, River watched from various vantage points around the cabin, gradually expanding its territory from the area near the wood stove to include the space beneath Jack's bed and a spot in the corner where afternoon sunlight created a warm patch on the wooden floor. By evening, a tentative truce had been established. River seemed to understand that Jack posed no threat, and Jack had learned to interpret the Bobcat's body language well enough to avoid causing it undue stress. He made another call to Mark, updating him on River's remarkable recovery. "That's incredible," Mark exclaimed. "Most wild animals would be totally panicked in a human dwelling." "This one seems different," Jack replied, watching as River delicately cleaned one paw near the fire. "Smart. Adaptable. Bobcats are highly intelligent predators," Mark said, his voice taking on the slightly professorial tone it often did when discussing wildlife. "They have to be, to survive in such varied habitats. But still, it's unusual for one to become comfortable around humans so quickly." "I wouldn't say comfortable," Jack corrected. "More like tolerant. He knows I helped him, I think. Maybe. Or maybe he's just biding his time until he's strong enough to head back to the wild. Either way, it's fascinating." After hanging up, Jack heated a portion of stew for himself and prepared another plate of meat scraps for River. The Bobcat approached the food more confidently this time, though it still maintained a cautious distance from Jack. "No rush," Jack told the animal quietly. "We've got time." That night, River chose to sleep on the braided rug near the fire rather than hiding under the furniture. Jack took it as a sign of progress. As he drifted off to sleep in his own bed, he found himself smiling at the strange turn his solitary life had taken. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone in the cabin, and somehow, the presence of the wild creature felt right, as though a missing piece had fallen into place. The days fell into a comfortable routine. Each morning, Jack would wake to find River in a different spot in the cabin, always alert but increasingly relaxed in his presence. They would share breakfast, coffee and oatmeal for Jack, various meat offerings for River, before Jack ventured out to check his traps and hunting blinds. At first, he secured the cabin when he left, concerned that the Bobcat might attempt to escape and injure itself in the process. But after the third day, when he returned to find River calmly grooming himself on the windowsill, Jack began leaving the door unlatched. "You're free to go whenever you're ready," he told the Bobcat. "No need to make a jailbreak." River made no attempt to leave, however. As the days passed, the young Bobcat grew visibly stronger. The matted patches in his fur smoothed out, revealing the beautiful tawny coat with its distinctive markings. His movements became more fluid, more confident, and his appetite increased substantially. Jack found himself supplementing the Bobcat's diet with fresh rabbit from his snares, which River accepted with evident appreciation. A week after the rescue, Jack woke before dawn to find River sitting on his chest, yellow-green eyes studying him intently in the dim light. Jack remained perfectly still, breath caught in his throat. The Bobcat's face was inches from his own, close enough that he could feel the animal's warm breath on his cheek. For a long moment, they regarded each other silently, man and wild creature locked in a gaze that seemed to transcend their natural boundaries. Then River delicately extended one paw and patted Jack's beard, as though testing its texture. The gesture was so unexpected, so incongruously gentle, that Jack couldn't help but laugh. The sound startled the Bobcat, who leapt gracefully from the bed and retreated to his favorite spot by the wood stove. "Well, good morning to you too," Jack said, still chuckling as he sat up. "Getting mighty familiar, aren't we?" That afternoon, Jack decided it was time to see how River would respond to the outdoors. The weather had moderated slightly, with temperatures rising above freezing for the first time since the Bobcat's rescue. Jack opened the cabin door wide and stepped outside, then waited on the small porch to see what River would do. For several minutes, the Bobcat remained inside, watching cautiously from just beyond the threshold. Then, with deliberate steps, River emerged into the winter sunlight. The animal paused, sniffing the air and scanning the surrounding forest with alert eyes. Jack remained motionless, barely breathing as he watched the wild creature reacquaint itself with its natural environment. River ventured a few steps into the yard, then a few more, moving with increasing confidence. The Bobcat explored the perimeter of the clearing where Jack's cabin stood, occasionally disappearing into the underbrush only to reappear moments later in a different location. Throughout it all, River maintained an awareness of Jack's position, frequently glancing back toward the porch as though to confirm the man was still there. After about an hour, during which River's explorations took him progressively further from the cabin, the Bobcat surprised Jack by trotting directly back to the porch and sitting at his feet. The animal looked up at him expectantly, tail twitching slightly. "Had enough of the great outdoors for one day?" Jack asked, bemused. River responded by standing and walking back into the cabin, where he promptly curled up on the braided rug in front of the cold fireplace. Jack followed, shaking his head in wonderment. "You're a strange one, River. No doubt about that." That evening, as Jack prepared dinner, his satellite phone rang, an unusual occurrence, as few people had the number. It was Caroline, Mark's mother and Jack's ex-wife. Her voice, even after 8 years of separation, still triggered a complex mixture of emotions in Jack's chest. "Jack, it's Caroline. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "No, it's fine," he replied, watching as River perked up at the sound of the unfamiliar voice coming through the speaker. "Everything okay with Mark?" "Mark's fine. Actually, that's why I'm calling. He told me about the Bobcat you rescued." Jack smiled ruefully. Of course Mark had shared the story with his mother. The boy had never been able to keep exciting news to himself. "River," Jack supplied. "That's what I've been calling him." "River," Caroline repeated, and Jack could hear the smile in her voice. "Mark says you're nursing him back to health yourself." "Trying to. He's doing remarkably well, all things considered." There was a brief silence on the line, filled with the weight of shared history and the careful navigation of their post-divorce relationship. "That's very like you, Jack," Caroline finally said, taking in a wild thing, caring for it. Her words carried meanings beyond their surface, an acknowledgement, perhaps, of the qualities in Jack that had first drawn her to him, even as those same qualities had eventually contributed to their separation. Jack's deep connection to the natural world, his instinctive understanding of wild creatures, had been both his greatest strength and his most significant blind spot in human relationships. "It seemed like the right thing to do," he said simply. "Mark is very excited about meeting River when he visits next month. He talks about little else." Jack felt a surge of warmth at the thought of his son's enthusiasm. "I've been telling River all about him. Can't promise the Bobcat will still be here by then, though. He gets stronger every day. Well, either way, it'll be good for Mark to spend time with you. He misses you, you know, more than he lets on." "I miss him too," Jack admitted quietly. After hanging up, Jack found himself unusually reflective. His conversation with Caroline had stirred memories of their life together. The early years when Mark was small, and they'd still believed they could bridge the gap between Jack's love of solitude and Caroline's need for community and connection. They'd tried, both of them, but in the end, the differences had proven too fundamental. River, sensing Jack's shift in mood, approached cautiously and sat near his feet, yellow-green eyes fixed on Jack's face with what almost appeared to be concern. After a moment's hesitation, Jack reached down and gently stroked the Bobcat's head. It was the first time he'd attempted to pet the wild animal, and he half expected River to recoil or even swipe at him with sharp claws. Instead, River leaned slightly into the touch, eyes half closing in what seemed like pleasure. The simple connection, hand to fur, human to wild thing, eased something in Jack's chest that had been tight and painful since the phone call. "You're good company, River," he murmured. "Better than I deserve, probably." 2 weeks after the rescue, River was fully recovered, a sleek, powerful predator with bright eyes and a graceful stride that belied the near-death experience by the frozen creek. The Bobcat now spent much of each day outdoors, exploring the forest around the cabin and occasionally bringing back evidence of successful hunts. Twice, Jack had found small offerings on the porch, a rabbit once, and another time, a grouse with barely a feather out of place. He'd accepted the gifts with grave thanks, understanding the significance of the gesture in River's world. The Bobcat continued to return to the cabin each evening, though seemingly content to share Jack's space during the cold winter nights. Their routine had evolved into a comfortable coexistence that respected the boundaries between them while acknowledging the unusual bond they'd formed. Jack knew that River would eventually return to the wild permanently. It was the natural order of things, and Jack had no desire to tame the magnificent creature who had become his unexpected companion. But he found himself treasuring each day of River's continued presence, each small interaction that bridged the divide between their worlds. As December progressed, Jack began preparing for Mark's visit. He cleaned the cabin more thoroughly than he had in years, organized the small guest area where his son would sleep, and even strung some modest decorations, pine cones and dried berries, around the main room. He wanted everything to be perfect for Mark's first Christmas at the cabin since the divorce. 3 days before Mark was scheduled to arrive, a serious winter storm swept through the region. Heavy snow fell for nearly 24 hours, accompanied by howling winds that created massive drifts against the cabin walls. Jack spent hours clearing paths to the woodshed and outhouse, muscles burning with the effort. River watched from the porch, occasionally venturing into the snow to investigate particularly interesting drifts before retreating to the relative warmth of the cabin. By the time the storm passed, nearly 2 feet of fresh snow blanketed the forest, transforming the landscape into a pristine white wilderness. The temperature plummeted in the storm's wake, turning the fresh powder into a crystalline surface that crunched underfoot and sparkled blindingly in the winter sunlight. Jack knew the hazards such conditions presented. The beauty disguised real dangers: hypothermia, frostbite, disorientation in the featureless white terrain. He made a mental note to remind Mark about proper winter precautions when he arrived, though the boy had grown up hearing Jack's warnings about respecting the power of nature. The day before Mark's arrival, Jack ventured into town for supplies. The trip took longer than usual due to the snow-covered roads, and by the time he returned to the cabin, twilight was settling over the forest. As he approached the small clearing, Jack noticed fresh tracks in the snow, not River's familiar prints, but the larger, rounded impressions of a bear. "Shouldn't you be hibernating?" Jack muttered, following the tracks with his eyes to where they disappeared into the trees on the far side of the clearing. Black bears weren't uncommon in the area, though they typically denayed up for the winter months. This one was likely a young male, perhaps displaced from its usual territory or disturbed from its winter sleep by the recent storm. Jack made a mental note to secure the cabin's food supplies more carefully and to warn Mark to be extra vigilant during his visit. River was waiting on the porch when Jack reached the cabin, and the Bobcat's behavior confirmed Jack's concerns. The animal was tense, ears swiveling to track sounds from the forest, eyes fixed on the tree line where the bear tracks disappeared. Jack quickly ushered River inside and unloaded his supplies, keeping his rifle close at hand as he worked. That night, River refused to settle, pacing restlessly between the window and the door. Jack recognized the Bobcat's agitation as a warning. River's senses, more finely tuned than his own, were detecting the continued presence of the bear in the vicinity. Jack checked and rechecked the cabin's door and windows, ensuring everything was secure before finally retiring to bed, his rifle propped within easy reach. Morning brought no sign of the bear, but River remained unusually alert, spending more time watching the forest edge than exploring. Jack decided to check the area around the cabin more thoroughly before Mark's arrival, not wanting to risk an unexpected encounter between his son and a potentially aggressive bear. The investigation revealed fresh bear tracks circling the cabin, along with disturbed snow around the woodshed where the animal had apparently attempted to gain entry. Jack reinforced the shed's door and cleared away anything that might attract the bear's attention, all the while keeping a watchful eye on the surrounding forest. By late afternoon, Jack was satisfied that he'd taken reasonable precautions. He returned to the cabin to prepare for Mark's arrival the following day, his anticipation growing with each passing hour. River seemed to sense Jack's excitement, watching curiously as he made final preparations to the guest's sleeping area and planned meals that would appeal to his son's appetite. "He's going to love you," Jack told the Bobcat as he worked. Mark's always had a way with animals. That night, Jack dreamed of Caroline and Mark as they'd been years ago, a young family, still whole, still finding their way together. In the dream, they were walking through summer woods, Mark running ahead on sturdy little legs, pointing excitedly at birds and squirrels. Caroline's hand was warm in Jack's, her laughter bright in the dappled sunlight. The dream was so vivid, so real, that waking brought a moment of profound disorientation and loss. Jack lay in the pre-dawn darkness, listening to River's soft breathing from his spot near the wood stove. The ache in his chest was familiar, the price of choices made and paths not taken. But for the first time in years, the pain was tempered by anticipation. Mark was coming home. Not permanently, not completely, but enough. It was enough. Mark arrived shortly after noon, his battered Honda creating a discordant note in the winter silence as it labored up the narrow access road to the cabin. Jack stood on the porch, heart pounding ridiculously in his chest as he watched his son emerge from the vehicle, taller than Jack remembered, broader through the shoulders, but with the same quick smile that had always been pure Caroline. "Dad," Mark called, waving as he retrieved his duffel bag from the car's trunk. "Welcome home, son," Jack replied, the words catching slightly in his throat. They embraced awkwardly on the porch, two men unaccustomed to physical demonstrations of affection but bound by blood and shared history. Mark smelled of coffee and some citrusy cologne, scents from a world Jack rarely visited, but that clung to his son like invisible markers of his other life. "How was the drive?" Jack asked, taking Mark's bag and leading him inside. "Not bad until the last 20 miles or so. The main roads are clear, but your access road is pretty rough. Where's River? I've been dying to meet him." Jack smiled at his son's enthusiasm. "He's around, probably watching us right now, deciding whether you're trustworthy. He'll show himself when he's ready." The cabin felt different with Mark in it, smaller in some ways, but warmer, more alive. Jack watched as his son moved around the familiar space, touching objects, examining changes, reacquainting himself with the place that had been his second home throughout childhood. There was a strange doubling in Jack's vision, the grown man before him overlaid with memories of the boy who had once practiced casting a fishing line in the yard, who had built elaborate forts from fallen branches, who had asked endless questions about every plant and animal in the surrounding forest. "You've added some decorations," Mark observed, nodding toward the pine cones and berries strung along the mantel. "Thought it would make things more festive," Jack replied, feeling unaccountably embarrassed by the modest attempt at holiday cheer. Mark's smile was warm. "It's perfect, Dad." They were putting away Mark's things when River finally made his appearance. The Bobcat emerged silently from beneath Jack's bed, where he'd apparently been hiding since Mark's arrival. With deliberate steps, River approached the newcomer, head low, ears alert, eyes fixed intently on Mark's face. Mark froze, his expression a mixture of awe and delight. "Hey there," he said softly, crouching slowly to bring himself closer to the Bobcat's level. "You must be River. I've heard a lot about you." River continued his cautious approach, circling Mark once before stopping directly in front of him. The Bobcat stretched his neck forward, sniffing Mark's outstretched hand with delicate precision. Whatever River detected seemed to satisfy him, for the Bobcat then did something that left Jack speechless. He bumped his head gently against Mark's fingers, a gesture unmistakably similar to a house cat's request for attention. Mark laughed softly, glancing up at Jack with wonder in his eyes. "He's amazing," he whispered. "I can't believe how comfortable he is." "He likes you," Jack said simply. "Can't say I'm surprised." The three of them settled into an easy rhythm over the next few days. Mark spent hours observing River, taking notes and photographs for a project, he explained. Jack suspected the project was as much an excuse to spend time with the Bobcat as it was an actual academic assignment, but he said nothing. It was good to see his son so engaged, so present in the moment rather than distracted by the technology that usually dominated young people's attention. They fell into comfortable routines. Morning coffee shared as the sun rose over the pines. Afternoons spent checking traps and exploring familiar trails. Evenings filled with simple meals and quiet conversation by the fire. River moved between them with growing confidence, sometimes accompanying them on shorter walks around the cabin, other times remaining behind to nap in favored spots warmed by winter sunlight. On their third day together, Mark broached a subject Jack had been avoiding. "Mom asked me to tell you she's thinking about selling the Chicago house," he said as they sat by the fire after dinner, River curled between them on the worn rug. "She's been offered a position at the University of Washington, Seattle." Jack absorbed this information slowly, considering its implications. The Chicago house had been their family home for 15 years, the place where Mark had taken his first steps, lost his first tooth, graduated from high school. Jack had moved out 8 years ago, but some part of him had always thought of it as home, even after all this time. "Seattle's a long way from Michigan," he said finally. Mark nodded, poking at the fire with a stick. "She said to tell you she'd make sure I could still visit during breaks. That distance wouldn't change anything important." Jack studied his son's profile, so like Caroline's in certain lights, the same determined chin, the same slight furrow between the brows when concerned. "What do you think about it?" he asked. Mark shrugged, his gesture deliberately casual in a way that told Jack this mattered more than his son wanted to admit. "It's a great opportunity for her. The program at UW is one of the best in the country." "That's not what I asked." Mark was silent for a long moment, his attention seemingly fixed on River, who had rolled onto his back, exposing his belly to the fire's warmth. "I think," he began hesitantly, "I think I'm old enough now that it doesn't matter as much where either of you live. I'll be making my own choices soon. But, Jack prompted gently, "but I still want to know I can come home sometimes. To places that feel like they're mine, even when everything else changes." The simple honesty of the statement caught at Jack's heart. He reached out and squeezed his son's shoulder, words momentarily beyond him. "This place will always be here," he said when he could trust his voice. "Always be yours, whenever you need it." Mark nodded, blinking rapidly. "I know, Dad." River, perhaps sensing the emotional undercurrent, rose and stretched before moving deliberately to Mark's side, pressing against the young man's leg in what seemed remarkably like a gesture of comfort. Mark laughed shakily, scratching behind the Bobcat's ears. "See? Even River agrees." The moment passed, the conversation turning to lighter topics, but Jack found himself thinking about Mark's words long after his son had gone to bed. Places that feel like they're mine, even when everything else changes. The cabin had been that for Jack, a constant in a world of variables. He hoped it could be that for Mark too, a touchstone to return to when needed. The following day dawned bright and cold, perfect conditions for what Jack had planned. After breakfast, he suggested they check some traps he'd set along Timber Creek, about 2 miles from the cabin. "We can follow the creek back afterward," he told Mark as they prepared to leave. "Might see if we can spot where River broke through the ice." Mark's enthusiasm was immediate. "Great idea. I've been wanting to see the exact spot. Maybe take some photos for my project." River watched their preparations with evident interest, moving between them as they gathered gear and pulled on heavy winter clothing. When they opened the door to leave, the Bobcat slipped out ahead of them, waiting expectantly in the yard. "Looks like we've got company," Jack observed with a smile. "Is it safe for him to come along?" Mark asked. "I mean, he is wild, even if he seems comfortable with us." "He comes and goes as he pleases these days," Jack replied. "Has his own agenda. If he wants to tag along, I won't stop him." The three set out across the snow-covered clearing, River moving ahead in graceful bounds that barely disturbed the crystalline surface. Jack led the way into the forest, following a familiar trail now transformed by winter into a winding corridor between snow-laden pines. Mark followed close behind, occasionally stopping to photograph particularly beautiful vistas or animal tracks preserved in the pristine snow. They had been walking for about 40 minutes when Jack froze, one hand raised in a silent signal that Mark recognized from childhood hunting trips. River, several yards ahead, had also gone still, his tawny body rigid with alertness. "What is it?" Mark whispered, moving carefully to his father's side. "Bear," Jack replied quietly, pointing to fresh tracks that crossed their path. "The same one that's been hanging around the cabin, looks like." Mark studied the tracks with interest. "Black bear? Shouldn't it be hibernating?" "Should be, yes. This one's either been disturbed from its den or never settled in properly. Makes it unpredictable." River had advanced to the bear tracks and was examining them intently, head low, ears swiveling to catch any sound from the surrounding forest. After a moment, the Bobcat looked back at Jack and Mark, then deliberately continued along the trail, moving with increased caution. "He's tracking it," Mark said with surprise. Jack nodded. "Curious, I guess. But we should be careful. A hungry bear this time of year isn't something to take lightly." They proceeded with greater caution, Jack's hand resting lightly on the rifle slung over his shoulder. The forest had gone quiet around them. No bird calls, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving an expectant stillness broken only by the soft crunch of their boots on snow. The trail eventually opened onto Timber Creek, now a ribbon of white winding through the winter landscape. Jack led them downstream to where he'd set several traps days earlier. Two were empty, but the third had caught a snowshoe hare, a good-sized specimen with thick winter fur. "Perfect timing," Jack said as he reset the trap after retrieving the hare. "We can have rabbit stew tonight." Mark was examining the creek ice, his gaze following the frozen surface to where it disappeared around a bend. "Is that where you found River?" he asked, pointing downstream. "Just around that bend." "Yes," Jack confirmed. "Want to take a look?" They followed the creek's course, River trotting alongside them with occasional forays into the undergrowth. The Bobcat seemed particularly interested in the bear tracks, which continued to parallel the creek at irregular intervals. Jack kept a watchful eye on their surroundings, increasingly uneasy about the bear's continued presence in the area. When they reached the spot where Jack had found River, Mark knelt at the creek's edge, studying the ice. The surface showed no sign of the drama that had unfolded there weeks earlier. Nature had erased all evidence, the creek freezing smooth and unblemished after Jack's rescue efforts. "It's amazing he survived," Mark said quietly. "The water must have been just above freezing." "He's tough," Jack replied, watching as River investigated the area, sniffing at the ice as though trying to recapture the scent of his own near-death experience. "Fighters usually find a way." Mark glanced up at his father, a knowing look in his eyes. "Like someone else I know." Jack felt a flush of embarrassment at the comparison. "Don't know about that. I just do what needs doing." "That's what I mean," Mark said, rising to his feet and brushing snow from his knees. "You keep going, no matter what." It's what I've always admired most about you, Dad." The simple statement, delivered without fanfare, caught Jack unprepared. He cleared his throat, unsure how to respond to the unexpected praise from his son. "We should start heading back," he said finally. "Don't want to lose the light." Mark nodded, understanding his father's discomfort with emotional territory. "Lead the way." They had gone perhaps half a mile back toward the cabin when River suddenly tensed, fur bristling along his spine. The Bobcat froze, eyes fixed on a point in the forest to their right, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Jack raised his hand, signaling Mark to stop. "Stay behind me," he whispered, slowly unslinging his rifle. For several heartbeats, the forest remained still and silent. Then came a crashing sound as something large moved through the underbrush, heading directly toward them. "Up that tree," Jack ordered Mark, pointing to a sturdy pine with low branches. "Quick!" Mark hesitated. "What about you?" "I'll cover you." "Go." As Mark scrambled toward the tree, the bear emerged from the forest, a young male black bear, smaller than Jack had feared, but still a formidable presence. The animal was thin, its coat patchy in places, suggesting it hadn't fed well before winter set in. Its small eyes fixed on the humans with hungry interest. Jack raised his rifle, aiming carefully. He had no desire to kill the bear if it could be avoided, but he wouldn't risk his son's safety. "Hey!" he shouted, trying to intimidate the animal with noise. "Get out of here." The bear hesitated, seemingly confused by Jack's aggressive stance. It rocked uncertainly on its feet, head swinging between Jack and Mark, who had managed to climb several branches up the pine tree. For a moment, Jack thought the animal might retreat. Then the bear caught sight of the rabbit carcass hanging from Jack's belt. With a huffing grunt, it charged. What happened next unfolded with dreamlike clarity, each moment distinct and vivid in Jack's perception. He fired a warning shot into the ground near the bear, hoping to frighten it off without injury. The report echoed through the winter forest, momentarily freezing the bear in its tracks. But hunger overrode caution, and the animal resumed its charge after only a brief pause. Jack prepared to fire again, this time aiming for a killing shot, when a tawny blur launched itself from a nearby snowdrift. River hit the bear from the side, claws extended, a screech of challenge tearing from the bobcat's throat. Though significantly smaller than the bear, River's attack was so unexpected, so ferocious, that the larger animal stumbled sideways, roaring in surprise and pain as the bobcat's claws raked across its face. "River!" "No!" Mark shouted from the tree. Jack held his fire, unwilling to risk hitting the bobcat as the two animals tumbled in a snarling, spitting knot of fur and fury. Despite the size disadvantage, River fought with calculated precision, darting in to slash at vulnerable points before dancing away from the bear's powerful swipes. The distraction gave Jack the opening he needed. Moving quickly to the side to get a clear shot, he fired once, the bullet striking the ground directly in front of the bear. The explosion of snow and dirt, combined with River's relentless harassment, finally convinced the bear to abandon its pursuit. With a final roar of frustration, it lumbered back into the forest, River pursuing it for several yards before returning to Jack's side, sides heaving with exertion, but otherwise apparently unharmed. "Are you okay?" Mark called, beginning to descend from his perch. "Fine," Jack replied, his heart still hammering in his chest. "Stay there until I'm sure it's gone." He scanned the forest edge carefully, rifle ready, while River paced restlessly nearby, occasionally stopping to groom blood, the bear's, not his own, from his fur. After several minutes of silence, Jack finally relaxed slightly. "I think we're clear," he told Mark. "Come on down." As soon as Mark's feet touched the ground, he rushed to examine River. "Is he hurt?" "That was incredible. I can't believe he attacked a bear." Jack knelt beside the bobcat, running practiced hands over the animal's body to check for injuries. River submitted to the examination with unusual patience, occasionally bumping his head against Jack's arm as though to reassure him. "He seems fine," Jack concluded with relief. "Lucky for all of us. That could have gone very differently." Mark's eyes were wide with awe. "He saved us, Dad. He actually saved us." Jack nodded, still processing what had happened. "Let's get back to the cabin. I want to put some distance between us and that bear, just in case it decides to circle back." They made the return journey in record time, moving swiftly through the gathering twilight with River ranging ahead as though scouting their path. By the time the cabin came into view, darkness had nearly fallen, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Once inside with the door securely barred, Jack built up the fire while Mark prepared hot coffee. River positioned himself by the window, yellow-green eyes fixed on the forest edge as though standing guard. The Bobcat's alertness reminded Jack that the danger might not have passed entirely. "I think we should take turns keeping watch tonight," he told Mark as they settled by the fire with steaming mugs. "That bear knows where to find us, and it's desperate enough that it might try its luck again." Mark nodded soberly. "I'll take first watch. You should rest, Dad." Jack started to protest, then reconsidered. His son wasn't a child anymore, but a capable young man offering to shoulder his share of responsibility. It was time Jack acknowledged that. "Wake me in 4 hours," he agreed. "And Mark, don't take any chances. If you see or hear anything suspicious, wake me immediately." "I will," Mark promised. Jack retreated to his bed, though he doubted he would sleep deeply. River remained at his post by the window for nearly an hour before finally padding over to curl up beside Jack, a warm presence against his side. The Bobcat's proximity was comforting, a reminder of the unlikely ally they had found in this wild creature. Despite his concerns, exhaustion eventually pulled Jack into sleep. His last conscious thought a prayer of thanks that Mark was safe. Jack woke suddenly, every sense alert. The cabin was dark except for the dim glow of embers in the fireplace. Something had disturbed his sleep, a sound, a presence, something his subconscious had registered as wrong. River was no longer beside him. Jack sat up slowly, eyes adjusting to the darkness. Mark was slumped in the chair by the window, clearly having dozed off during his watch. Outside, the night was silent, the kind of profound stillness that often precedes dawn in the winter forest. Then he heard it, a soft scraping at the rear of the cabin, near the small window that ventilated the storage area. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic, the work of something with purpose rather than the random noises of tree branches in the wind. Moving silently, Jack retrieved his rifle and crossed to where Mark slept. He shook his son gently, pressing a finger to his lips when Mark's eyes flew open in confusion. "Something's trying to get in," Jack whispered. The back window. Mark was instantly alert, years of his father's training overcoming the disorientation of sleep. "The bear. Probably. Where's River?" They both scanned the cabin's interior. The Bobcat was nowhere to be seen. "He was here when I dozed off," Mark said anxiously. Maybe he heard something and hid. The scraping intensified, followed by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. Jack motioned for Mark to stay back, then moved toward the storage area, rifle ready. Before he could reach the door connecting it to the main room, a crash echoed through the cabin, followed by the panicked bellows of the bear and the high, screaming challenge of a bobcat. "River!" Mark gasped. Jack yanked open the storage room door to find chaos. Shelves overturned, supplies scattered across the floor, and the bear halfway through the broken window, its massive head and shoulders inside, while River harassed it from behind, claws raking at its haunches. The confined space made firing the rifle dangerous. A missed shot could ricochet with deadly effect. Instead, Jack grabbed a heavy iron poker from beside the wood stove and advanced on the bear, shouting at the top of his lungs while banging the poker against the wall. The combined assault, River from behind, Jack from within, finally convinced the bear to retreat. It backed out through the window with a roar of frustration, sending a shower of broken glass into the snow outside. Jack rushed to the window. poking the heavy curtain into the opening to temporarily block it while checking that the bear was truly retreating. "It's heading into the trees," he reported to Mark, who had positioned himself at the main room window. "River's still after it." "Will he be okay?" Mark asked anxiously. "He knows what he's doing," Jack replied, though concern for the bobcat twisted in his gut. "Right now, we need to secure this window before that bear circles back." Working quickly, they nailed boards across the broken window, using supplies from Jack's emergency repair kit. The makeshift barricade wouldn't stop a determined bear, but it might slow it down long enough for them to respond if it returned. With the immediate threat addressed, Jack's thoughts turned to River. The bobcat had been gone for nearly 20 minutes now, far longer than seemed necessary to chase off the retreating bear. "He'll come back," Mark said, reading Jack's worry. "He's smart. He wouldn't take on more than he could handle." Jack nodded, hoping his son was right. The bobcat had proven remarkably resilient and intelligent, but a prolonged confrontation with a hungry bear would test any animal's capabilities. As dawn lightened the eastern sky, they kept vigil by the windows, watching for any sign of either River or the bear. Jack made coffee, the familiar ritual helping to steady his nerves as they waited. Mark sorted through the damaged supplies in the storage room, salvaging what he could and making an inventory of what needed to be replaced. The sun had just cleared the treetops when Mark's exclamation drew Jack to the front window. "There, by the big pine." Jack followed his son's pointing finger and felt relief wash through him. River was trotting across the clearing toward the cabin, moving with his usual fluid grace despite what must have been an exhausting night. The bobcat paused at the edge of the yard, scanning the surroundings with characteristic thoroughness before approaching the cabin. Jack opened the door, and River slipped inside, immediately rubbing against Jack's legs in a gesture that seemed both reassurance and greeting. The bobcat's fur was disheveled in places, and he bore a few minor scratches, but appeared otherwise unharmed. "You crazy cat," Jack murmured, kneeling to examine River more closely. "Taking on a bear twice in 24 hours. You trying to give me a heart attack?" River bumped his head against Jack's chest, a rumbling sound somewhere between a purr and a growl vibrating through his body. Mark joined them, relief evident in his face as he stroked River's back. "He saved us again," Mark said, wonder in his voice. "He must have heard the bear trying to break in and gone around to distract it." Jack nodded, still marveling at the bobcat's actions. Wild animals typically acted from instinct and self-interest, yet River had repeatedly placed himself in danger to protect them. It defied conventional understanding of wildlife behavior, suggesting something deeper at work, a connection that transcended the usual boundaries between human and animal. "I think," Jack said slowly, "we need to accept that this is no ordinary bobcat." Mark smiled. "I figured that out the day I arrived. The way he looks at us, it's like he understands everything we say, everything we feel even." After ensuring River was truly uninjured, they set about making breakfast, a heartier meal than usual, with extra portions for the heroic bobcat. As they ate, they discussed their options regarding the bear. "We should report it to the conservation officer," Mark suggested. "A bear this persistent, this comfortable approaching human dwellings, is dangerous." Jack agreed reluctantly. He preferred to handle situations himself when possible, maintaining the separation between his world and the authorities, but Mark was right. The bear posed a threat not just to them, but to any hikers or campers in the area. "I'll call it in after breakfast," he conceded. "They'll probably send someone out to track and relocate it." "What about River?" Mark asked, watching the bobcat methodically clean his paws after devouring the generous helping of rabbit meat they'd provided. "What happens when I leave? Will he stay with you?" It was a question Jack had been avoiding. River had shown no inclination to permanently return to the wild, seeming content with the arrangement they'd established. But Jack knew better than to assume permanence when it came to wild creatures. River had his own nature, his own destiny to fulfill. "That's up to him," Jack replied finally. He's free to go whenever he chooses. Always has been. Mark nodded thoughtfully. He knows that, I think. That's why he stays. After breakfast, Jack made the call to the local conservation office, reporting the aggressive bear and the damage to the cabin. The officer who took the report promised to send a team out within 24 hours to track and relocate the animal. With that responsibility addressed, Jack suggested they use the remaining days of Mark's visit to enjoy the woods without venturing too far from the cabin. The risk of another encounter with the bear was too great to justify extended trips until the conservation team had done their work. They spent the day in companionable activities, chopping firewood, repairing the damaged storage room, preparing for Christmas with simple decorations fashioned from pine boughs and birch bark. River remained close, occasionally helping in his own way by dragging smaller branches to the woodpile or investigating the storage room repairs with curious sniffs. As evening approached, they settled before the fire, the conversation turning to Mark's plans for the future. He would graduate in 18 months, he explained, and was considering graduate programs in wildlife biology or conservation management. I've been thinking, he said hesitantly, about applying to programs in this region. Northern Michigan, maybe Minnesota or Wisconsin. Somewhere I could specialize in northern forest ecosystems. Jack tried to keep his expression neutral, though hope flared in his chest. Good schools in those areas, he said cautiously. Strong research programs. And they're closer to here, Mark added, meeting his father's eyes directly. I've missed this place. Missed you. The simple honesty in his son's voice touched something deep in Jack. I've missed you too, son. More than I've been good at saying. River, sensing the emotional undercurrent, moved to sit between them, his presence a bridge connecting father and son. Mark smiled, scratching behind the Bobcat's ears. You know, he said thoughtfully, River reminded me of something important. Something I think we both forgot for a while. What's that? Jack asked. That sometimes the strongest connections don't need words. They just need presence. Showing up when it matters. Mark's gaze was steady, meaningful. Like you always did, Dad. Even when you and Mom were having problems, you never missed something that was important to me. Never. Jack swallowed hard against the tightness in his throat. I tried. Wasn't always sure I was getting it right. You got the important parts right, Mark assured him. The rest, well, nobody's perfect. They sat in comfortable silence after that, the fire crackling softly, River's warmth between them a tangible reminder of the unexpected bond that had brought them to this moment of understanding. Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold. Jack woke early, as was his habit, to find River curled at the foot of his bed and the smell of coffee already filling the cabin. Mark was at the table, a small package wrapped in brown paper and pine twigs before him. Merry Christmas Eve, he said as Jack sat up. Hope you don't mind. I started the coffee. Never mind good coffee, Jack replied, pulling on his heavy flannel robe. What's that you've got there? Mark pushed the package toward him with a smile. Just a little something. Thought you might like to open it today. Jack took the package, surprised and touched by the gesture. He unwrapped it carefully to reveal a handsomely bound journal with a tooled leather cover depicting pine trees and mountains. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the leather supple and rich with the smell of traditional tanning methods. Mark, this is beautiful, Jack said, running his fingers over the cover. Open it, Mark urged. Inside, the first page bore an inscription in Mark's careful handwriting. For Dad, to record the stories of the forest and its creatures, because some tales deserve to be remembered. Love, Mark. I thought, Mark explained as Jack struggled to find words, that you might want to write down River's story, and maybe other stories from your years in these woods. Things worth saving, worth passing down. Jack nodded, emotion making speech difficult. Thank you, he managed finally. It's perfect. River chose that moment to leap lightly from the bed and investigate the gift, sniffing at the leather with evident approval before butting his head against Jack's arm. See? River agrees. Mark laughed. Your adventures deserve documentation. They spent the morning preparing a special Christmas Eve meal. Venison steaks, potatoes roasted in the wood stove, and wild cranberry sauce Mark had brought from town. River was included in their preparations, receiving choice bits of meat and seated with them at the table as though he were simply another family member. As they ate, Jack found himself studying his son's face, noting the changes time had wrought. The stronger jaw, the confident set of his shoulders, the thoughtful eyes that missed nothing. Mark had grown into a fine young man, one who carried the best parts of both his parents while becoming entirely his own person. I'm proud of you, Jack said suddenly, the words emerging without premeditation. Should say that more often. Mark looked up, surprise giving way to pleasure at the unexpected praise. Thanks, Dad. That means a lot. After dinner, they exchanged the rest of their gifts, practical things mostly, in keeping with their shared appreciation for utility over extravagance. Jack had found a high-quality field guide to North American predators for Mark, while Mark presented his father with a new hunting knife of superior Swedish steel. River watched the proceedings with apparent interest, yellow-green eyes tracking each package as it was opened. When the gifts had all been exchanged, Mark disappeared briefly into the guest area, returning with something that made Jack laugh out loud, a red bandana tied into a rough collar. Before you object, Mark said quickly, I know he's wild and not a pet, but I thought, just for Christmas. To both their surprise, River submitted willingly to the bandana being tied loosely around his neck. The Bobcat seemed to recognize it as a ceremonial gesture rather than an attempt at domestication, accepting it with the same gravitas with which he approached all human rituals. Well, I'll be, Jack murmured. He actually seems to like it. Everyone likes to be included, Mark replied with a smile. As evening deepened into night, snow began to fall, large, lazy flakes drifting past the windows and accumulating on the cabin roof. The three of them settled by the fire, Jack in his armchair, Mark on the floor with his back against the hearth, and River stretched between them, occasionally shifting position to ensure equal contact with both humans. Jack found himself thinking about the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. How finding a half-dead bobcat in the ice had somehow led to this peaceful Christmas Eve with his son. If he hadn't taken that particular route that day, if he hadn't noticed the trapped animal, if he had chosen the merciful but final solution of his hunting knife, so many small decisions culminating in something unexpected and precious. Life's funny sometimes, he said aloud. Mark looked up from the book he was reading. How so? Just thinking about all the little choices that led us here. How different things might have been. Mark considered this, his expression thoughtful. I've been thinking about that too. About how saving River changed things between us. Changed things. Well, yeah. You called me more often to update me about him. I got more interested in coming to visit. We had something new to connect over. Mark shrugged. Sometimes people need a bridge, you know? Something outside themselves to help them find their way back to each other. The insight, so simply stated, struck Jack with unexpected force. Mark was right. River had been that bridge, a living connection between father and son when words alone had proven insufficient. When did you get so wise? Jack asked, only half joking. Mark smiled. Must have picked it up from someone. They fell silent again, comfortable in the quiet broken only by the crackle of the fire and River's occasional soft snores. Outside, the snow continued to fall, wrapping the cabin in a cocoon of white silence, separating them from the rest of the world. Jack opened the journal Mark had given him, running his fingers over the blank pages. There were stories to be told, histories to be recorded. Beginning with the day he'd found a half-dead bobcat frozen in the ice, and the remarkable events that had followed. He picked up a pencil and began to write. Christmas morning dawned bright and cold, the fresh snow glittering like diamond dust in the early sunlight. Jack woke to find River at the window, attentive as always to the world outside, the red bandana still secure around his neck. Mark was already up, stoking the fire and preparing coffee with the easy confidence of someone at home. "Merry Christmas, Dad," he called as Jack sat up. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in years," Jack replied truthfully. "Merry Christmas, son." They shared a simple breakfast before bundling up to check the perimeter of the cabin. The conservation officers wouldn't arrive until later in the day, according to the message Jack had received, but it was important to know if the bear had returned during the night. The fresh snow made tracking easy and reassuring. There were no bear prints near the cabin, suggesting their visitor had moved on to easier hunting grounds. River accompanied them on their inspection tour, occasionally disappearing into the underbrush only to reappear moments later in unexpected locations, as though conducting his own parallel patrol. As they completed their circuit of the cabin clearing, Mark paused at the edge of the forest, his expression suddenly serious. "Dad, there's something I've been wanting to talk to you about." Jack braced himself, recognizing the tone that often preceded difficult conversations. "I'm listening. I've been thinking about what happens next semester. With my research project." Mark hesitated, then continued more confidently. "I want to study human-wildlife interactions in managed forest environments. Specifically, case studies of unusual bonding between humans and wild predators." Understanding dawned slowly. "You're talking about River." Mark nodded eagerly. "It's a unique opportunity. A documented case of a wild bobcat forming a voluntary, sustained relationship with humans while maintaining its natural behaviors. It could contribute significantly to our understanding of wildlife behavior and cognition." "You want to study him," Jack stated flatly. "Make him a research subject." "Not in an invasive way," Mark hastened to explain. "Observational only. No tracking collars, no capture and release. Just documentation of his natural behaviors and interactions." Jack considered this, watching as River investigated a fallen log at the forest's edge. The bobcat had already defied conventional understanding of wildlife behavior. Perhaps there was value in recording that defiance, in helping others understand what was possible. "Would you need to be here to conduct this research?" Mark's expression brightened. "Ideally, yes. I was thinking about asking if I could spend my spring break here. Maybe some weekends when I can get away, if that's okay with you." The request, so casual, so significant, caught Jack off guard. His son wanted to spend more time here, with him, with River. The research project was genuine, Jack had no doubt, but he suspected it was also a bridge, a reason, an excuse perhaps, for father and son to rebuild what had been damaged by years of separation. "I think," Jack said carefully, "that would be just fine. River might have something to say about being observed, though." As if on cue, the bobcat looked up from his investigations, yellow-green eyes fixing on the two humans with what seemed remarkably like understanding. Then, with deliberate steps, River approached and positioned himself between Jack and Mark, sitting precisely in the middle as though making his own statement about the proposed arrangement. Mark laughed. "I think he approves." Jack nodded, a smile tugging at his lips despite his initial reservations. "Looks that way." They returned to the cabin, the conversation shifting to practical matters: when Mark might visit, what equipment he would need, how they would manage the research around Jack's hunting schedule. River moved between them as they talked, occasionally contributing soft chirps or trills that seemed almost like participation in the discussion. The conservation officers arrived shortly after noon, two efficient young women who took detailed reports of the bear encounters and examined the damage to the cabin with professional thoroughness. They were initially alarmed by River's presence, reaching instinctively for tranquilizer guns when the bobcat first appeared in the doorway. "It's okay," Jack assured them quickly. "He's a friend." The senior officer raised skeptical eyebrows, but lowered her weapon. "A friend, huh? Want to explain that?" Jack and Mark took turns relating River's story, from the rescue at the frozen creek to the recent bear encounters. As they spoke, River maintained a respectful distance from the visitors, his behavior impeccable, as though he understood the importance of making a good impression. "I've been working with wildlife for 15 years, the senior officer said when they'd finished, "and I've never heard anything quite like this." "It's remarkable," her younger colleague agreed, studying River with undisguised fascination. "Would you be willing to file a formal report? This kind of interaction could be valuable to our understanding of bobcat behavior." Mark exchanged a significant look with his father. "Actually, that's something we were just discussing. I'm an environmental science student at Michigan State, and I'm hoping to study this case as part of a research project." The officers were immediately supportive, offering access to department resources and expressing interest in the eventual findings. By the time they departed to begin tracking the bear, contact information had been exchanged and tentative plans made for future collaboration. "Well," Jack said as the conservation vehicle disappeared down the access road, "that went better than I expected." "They were really interested," Mark agreed enthusiastically. Officer Ramirez even mentioned the possibility of a small grant to support the research. Jack smiled at his son's excitement. "Just don't let River know he's becoming famous. Might go to his head." The bobcat in question was perched on the porch railing, watching the departing vehicle with the same intense focus he brought to all novel situations. The red bandana around his neck fluttered slightly in the winter breeze, making him look somewhat like a wild frontier scout from old Western tales. The remainder of Christmas Day passed in peaceful contentment. They prepared a simple but festive dinner, sharing the best portions with River, who accepted the holiday treats with dignified appreciation. As twilight gathered, they settled by the fire with cups of hot chocolate, the warmth and simple pleasures of the moment made more precious by the knowledge that Mark would be leaving in 2 days. "I've been thinking," Mark said after a comfortable silence, "about what you said regarding River eventually returning to the wild." Jack nodded, watching the bobcat who lay stretched between them on the hearth rug. "It's his nature. Wild things belong to themselves first." "I know," Mark agreed, "but I wonder if it has to be all or nothing. What if he chooses something in between? A life that includes both wilderness and this?" He gestured to encompass the cabin, his father, himself. The suggestion resonated with something Jack had been considering himself. River had already established a pattern that defied conventional wildlife behavior, coming and going freely, maintaining his hunting skills and territorial patrols while also choosing to return to human companionship. It wasn't domestication in any traditional sense, but rather a unique arrangement based on mutual respect and, Jack had come to believe, genuine affection. "Could be," Jack conceded. "He's already creating his own rules." "Exactly," Mark said, warming to the topic. "And that's what makes this case so valuable from a research perspective. It challenges our assumptions about the rigid boundaries between wild and tame, about the capacity of wild animals to form complex social bonds with species other than their own." Jack smiled at his son's academic enthusiasm, so reminiscent of Caroline in her most passionate moments of scientific discourse. "You sound like your mother when you get going like that." Mark returned the smile, acknowledging the comparison without embarrassment. "Good. Mom's brilliant. I'll take that as a compliment." "It was meant as one," Jack assured him. River, perhaps sensing he was the subject of their conversation, raised his head and fixed them with an inquiring gaze. The bobcat's yellow-green eyes, once so alien and inscrutable to Jack, now seemed to communicate a complex awareness that continually surprised him. "What do you think, River?" Mark asked, addressing the bobcat directly. "Planning to stick around? Or do you have big adventures waiting in the wilderness?" River's response was to rise, stretch with feline deliberation, and then settle himself half on Jack's lap and half on the floor, a position that allowed him to maintain contact while preserving his dignity. The message seemed clear. For now, at least, this was where he chose to be. The following day brought a change in the weather, warmer temperatures, and a light drizzle that turned the pristine snow to gray slush. Jack and Mark spent the morning indoors, organizing Mark's research plans and documenting River's behaviors and routines for the official study. The Bobcat observed these activities with apparent interest, occasionally positioning himself directly before the notebook where Mark was writing, as though offering corrections or additional information. By afternoon, the rain had stopped, and they ventured outside to check the conservation officer's progress. Fresh tracks indicated the team had indeed located and followed the bear away from the cabin area, heading deeper into the forest where natural food sources were more plentiful. With the immediate threat addressed, Jack suggested they walk to Timber Creek one last time before Mark's departure. "I'd like to get some more photos of the rescue site," Mark explained as they prepared to leave. For the research documentation, River accompanied them willingly, though the wet conditions clearly displeased him. The Bobcat picked his way carefully through the slushy snow, occasionally shaking a paw with evident distaste when it sank into a particularly deep puddle. "Not a fan of the wet, are you?" Jack observed with amusement. "Can't say I blame you, considering." The creek was running higher than usual, the recent precipitation and warmer temperatures having partially melted the ice along its edges. When they reached the spot where Jack had found River, the scene looked dramatically different from their previous visit. The creek's surface was a patchwork of ice and open water, the current visible as dark movement beneath translucent sections. Mark photographed the area from multiple angles, occasionally consulting with Jack about exact locations and details. River remained on the bank, showing understandable reluctance to approach the water that had nearly claimed his life. Instead, the Bobcat patrolled the perimeter, alert for any potential threats to his human companions. As they prepared to leave, Mark paused, gazing thoughtfully at the creek. "You know, it's kind of poetic," he said. "This place nearly took River's life, but in saving him, you created something new. A connection none of us expected." Jack considered his son's words, finding truth in them he hadn't fully articulated himself. "Life's like that sometimes," he replied. "Danger and opportunity, all mixed up together. You can't always tell which is which until later." "That's profound, Dad," Mark said with genuine appreciation. "You should put that in your journal." Jack smiled, slightly embarrassed by the praise. "Maybe I will." They began the walk back to the cabin, River ranging ahead as usual, occasionally disappearing into the underbrush only to reappear moments later from an unexpected direction. The Bobcat's movements were purposeful and efficient, a demonstration of his perfectly adapted physiology and instincts. Yet those same wild instincts had somehow expanded to include protection and companionship for the humans who had entered his life. When they reached the clearing around the cabin, Jack was surprised to see River suddenly freeze, fur bristling along his spine. The Bobcat's attention was fixed on the cabin itself, his posture communicating alarm rather than the relaxed familiarity he usually displayed upon returning home. "What is it?" Mark whispered, instinctively lowering his voice in response to River's tension. Jack scanned the cabin and surrounding area, his experienced eye detecting subtle signs of disturbance. Boot prints in the muddy snow leading to the porch, the door standing slightly ajar when he was certain they had closed it securely upon leaving. "Someone's been here," he said quietly. "Might still be inside." Mark's expression shifted from confusion to concern. "A break-in? Out here. Happens sometimes," Jack replied, his mind racing through possibilities. "Hikers get lost, look for shelter, or someone targeting remote cabins for supplies." He reached slowly for the rifle slung over his shoulder. "Stay behind me." River had already begun a cautious approach to the cabin, moving low to the ground in stalking posture, every muscle tense with alertness. Jack admired the Bobcat's natural caution, no headlong charge into potential danger, but rather a methodical assessment of the threat. "Should we wait for whoever it is to leave?" Mark suggested. "Or call the conservation officers?" Jack considered the options, weighing risks against practicalities. The cabin contained everything they needed for survival: food, shelter, communications. Abandoning it to an unknown intruder meant exposing themselves to the elements with night approaching. And the satellite phone was inside, making calling for help impossible without first reclaiming the cabin. We need to see what we're dealing with, he decided. Could be nothing serious, a lost hiker, like I said. But we need to know. Moving with the quiet deliberation that years in the forest had taught him, Jack approached the cabin from an angle that kept him partially concealed by woodshed. River paralleled his movement, maintaining perfect position for quick action while remaining out of sight from the cabin windows. Mark followed several paces behind, his urban upbringing evident in his less practiced stealth, though Jack noted with approval that his son stepped carefully, minimizing noise. When they reached the porch, Jack paused, listening intently. Faint sounds came from within, movement, the clink of glass or metal, a low voice. At least one person, then, and actively searching through their possessions. Jack motioned for Mark to stay back, then positioned himself beside the partially open door, rifle ready but not yet raised. River had circled to the side window, where a small gap in the curtain would allow the Bobcat to observe the interior. "Hello, the cabin," Jack called firmly, the traditional woodsman's announcement of presence. "Identify yourself." Silence fell immediately, followed by hurried movement inside. Jack tensed, prepared for various responses, aggression, attempted escape, perhaps surrender. What he didn't expect was the voice that finally answered. "Dad? Is that you?" Jack froze, the familiar voice striking him like a physical blow. "Caroline." He pushed the door open wider to reveal his ex-wife standing in the middle of the cabin, her expression a mixture of relief and embarrassment. She was dressed for the weather in practical hiking clothes, her dark hair shot through with more silver than when he'd last seen her, but otherwise unchanged. The same intelligent eyes, the same determined set to her jaw. "What are you doing here?" Jack asked, lowering his rifle as he stepped inside. "Surprising you and Mark for Christmas," Caroline replied, gesturing to several packages on the table and a basket of food items. "I tried calling, but the satellite phone went straight to voicemail. I thought I'd drive up and—" She trailed off, noticing Mark behind Jack. "Surprise." "Mom," Mark exclaimed, moving past his father to embrace Caroline. "I can't believe you're here. How did you find the place?" "I've been here before, remember?" she said, returning the hug warmly. "And your father hasn't exactly changed the location in 20 years. Jack remained by the door, still processing the unexpected development. Caroline, here, in his cabin. It had been years since they'd been in the same physical space for more than the brief moments required to exchange Mark during visitations, and those encounters had always occurred on neutral ground. Never here, in the place that had symbolized their fundamental differences. "It's good to see you, Jack," Caroline said, her voice softening as she met his gaze over Mark's shoulder. "You too," he managed, surprised to find he meant it. "This is unexpected. I know. I probably should have called ahead, but when Mark told me about the Bobcat rescue and how you two were spending Christmas together, I just—" She shrugged, a gesture so reminiscent of their son that Jack couldn't help but smile. "I wanted to be part of it, just for a little while." The mention of River seemed to break the spell that had momentarily frozen the Bobcat in place. He had remained uncharacteristically still during the reunion, assessing the newcomer with intense focus. Now, with deliberate steps, River entered the cabin fully and approached Caroline, maintaining a cautious distance while clearly studying her. "Oh," Caroline exclaimed softly, noticing the animal for the first time. "Is this—" "River," Mark confirmed proudly. "The Bobcat Dad rescued." Caroline's eyes widened with professional interest as well as natural caution. Though not a wildlife biologist herself, her work in environmental science had given her substantial knowledge of animal behavior. "He's magnificent," she breathed, remaining perfectly still as River circled her, sniffing occasionally. "And he's completely habituated to human presence. Remarkable." Jack watched the interaction with interest, noting that River displayed none of the aggression or extreme wariness he might have expected toward a stranger. Instead, the Bobcat's inspection seemed thorough but fundamentally accepting, as though Caroline's connection to Mark and Jack was sufficient recommendation. After completing his assessment, River sat directly before Caroline, yellow-green eyes fixed on her face with the same penetrating gaze he had first turned on Jack by the frozen creek. "What should I do?" Caroline whispered, clearly understanding the significance of the moment. "Just be still," Jack advised. "Let him decide." For several heartbeats, the cabin was silent as the Bobcat and woman regarded each other. Then, with the same deliberate movement he had used with Jack and later Mark, River extended one paw and delicately touched Caroline's knee before withdrawing to a respectful distance. "He's accepting you," Mark explained with evident excitement. "That's what he did with me when I first arrived." The tension in the cabin dissipated with River's apparent approval. Caroline relaxed visibly, and Jack felt his own shoulders loosen as the initial shock of her arrival gave way to a complex but not unpleasant emotional response. "I brought coffee," Caroline said, gesturing to the basket on the table. "Real coffee, not that swill you used to brew. And some decent food for Christmas dinner." "Hey," Jack protested mildly, "my coffee's improved over the years." "I'll believe that when I taste it," she replied with the hint of a smile. Mark looked between his parents, clearly delighted by the unexpected reunion and the relatively civil tone of their interaction. "This is amazing," he declared. "The whole family together for Christmas. Including River," he added, glancing at the Bobcat who had settled by the wood stove in his customary spot. "Speaking of which," Caroline said, reaching for one of the packages on the table, "I brought something for everyone, including, as it happens, your new friend." She handed Mark and Jack each a wrapped gift, then produced a small package that she unwrapped herself to reveal a supple leather collar with a small silver medallion attached. "I wasn't entirely sure what to expect," she explained, but Mark's descriptions made it clear this was an unusual situation. "The collar isn't for domestication," she added quickly, seeing Jack's expression. "It's for identification and protection. The tag has contact information and indicates that River is part of a university wildlife study, which, given what Mark's planning, isn't even a lie." Jack examined the collar with grudging approval. It was thoughtfully designed, lightweight, with a safety release mechanism that would allow it to break away if River became entangled while hunting or traversing difficult terrain. "It's a good idea," he admitted. "Protects him from hunters or trappers who might mistake him for an ordinary bobcat." "Exactly," Caroline nodded. "And it gives him a recognized status should he encounter conservation officers or park rangers." Mark's expression brightened further, if that were possible. "This is perfect, Mom. We can include it in the study protocol. Minimal intervention that provides maximum protection." River, apparently sensing that he was once again the subject of discussion, approached to investigate the collar. After a thorough sniffing, he appeared to lose interest, returning to his place by the stove with typical feline nonchalance. "I think that means he's okay with it," Mark interpreted with a laugh. The unexpected reunion created a strange new dynamic in the cabin. Not the tense coexistence Jack might have feared, but rather a cautious cordiality underscored by their shared history and mutual love for their son. As Caroline unpacked the food she brought, Mark regaled her with the full story of River's rescue and subsequent adventures, including the recent bear encounters. Jack found himself watching her as she listened, noting the familiar expressions that crossed her face, the raised eyebrow of scientific skepticism, the slight purse of her lips when considering improbable data, the unguarded smile when Mark's enthusiasm peaked. They had been apart for 8 years, yet he could still read her reactions as clearly as words on a page. "You took a significant risk," she observed when Mark described Jack's decision to rescue the Bobcat, "both in the initial rescue and in bringing a wild predator into your home. It was the right thing to do." Jack replied simply. Caroline's eyes met his, something unreadable passing through them. Yes, she agreed softly. It was. They prepared dinner together, falling into an unexpectedly comfortable rhythm. Jack was surprised to discover how much he remembered of their shared patterns. Caroline's preference for organizing ingredients before beginning preparation, her habit of humming softly while chopping vegetables, the precise way she timed multiple dishes to reach completion simultaneously. She had been an excellent partner in the kitchen, as in many aspects of life. Their problems had never stemmed from an inability to work together, but rather from fundamentally different visions of what life should contain. River observed the proceedings with evident interest, occasionally accepting small offerings from each of them, but primarily content to watch the human interaction from his various vantage points around the cabin. Mark moved between his parents with easy grace, bridging any awkward moments with questions or observations that kept conversation flowing. As they sat down to dinner, a far more elaborate meal than Jack had anticipated for the holiday, Caroline raised her glass in a toast. To unexpected reunions, she said, her gaze encompassing all of them, including River, who sat attentively beside the table. And to new beginnings. To new beginnings, Jack and Mark echoed, the simple phrase carrying different meanings for each of them. After dinner, they exchanged gifts. Jack was momentarily embarrassed that he had nothing for Caroline, but she waved off his concern. I didn't expect anything, she assured him. My showing up was hardly part of the plan. The gifts she had brought were thoughtfully selected. Leatherwork gloves for Jack, crafted by an artisan in Chicago who specialized in traditional techniques. A digital camera with exceptional macro capabilities for Mark's research, and the collar for River, which they decided to present to the Bobcat after dinner. River accepted the collar with surprising grace, allowing Mark to secure it loosely around his neck alongside the Christmas bandana. The medallion caught the firelight as the Bobcat moved, a flash of silver against his tawny fur. It suits him, Caroline observed. Distinguished. As the evening progressed, conversation flowed more easily than any of them might have anticipated. They spoke of Mark's studies, Caroline's research at the university, the environmental conservation projects they were each involved with from their different perspectives. Jack found himself sharing stories of his years in the cabin, wildlife encounters, seasonal changes, the small rhythms of forest life that had become the backdrop of his existence. You should visit the university sometime, Caroline suggested during a lull in the conversation. Give a guest lecture in Mark's wildlife management class. Your practical experience would be valuable for students who mostly learn from textbooks and controlled field studies. The invitation surprised Jack. I'm not much for formal teaching, he demurred. Or cities, for that matter. You taught me everything important about the forest, Mark pointed out. And you did it better than any professor I've had. That's different, Jack protested. That was just life. Exactly, Caroline said with unexpected fervor. That's what makes it valuable. You've lived what they're studying. Your insights come from direct experience, not abstract theory. Jack felt a flush of pleasure at the praise, especially coming from Caroline, whose academic credentials and scientific approach had often seemed at odds with his more intuitive understanding of the natural world. I'll think about it, he conceded. The conversation shifted to practical matters regarding Mark's planned research project. Caroline offered suggestions for methodology and documentation that would meet academic standards while respecting River's wild nature and Jack's preference for minimal technological intrusion in the forest environment. The key is finding balance, she explained, her hands sketching invisible diagrams in the air as she outlined her thoughts. Scientific rigor without disrupting the very behaviors we're trying to study. That's always been your specialty, Jack acknowledged. Finding the middle path. Caroline's expression softened at the recognition. Not always, she said quietly. Sometimes I miss the forest for the trees, if you'll pardon the very appropriate metaphor. The admission, gentle as it was, hung in the air between them. an acknowledgement of past difficulties that neither had been willing to voice during their separation. Jack found himself wanting to respond in kind, to offer his own recognition of the ways he had contributed to their failure, but the words caught in his throat, unpracticed and uncertain. River, perhaps sensing the emotional undercurrent, chose that moment to rise from his place near the fire and approach Caroline. With deliberate movements, the Bobcat positioned himself partly against her chair, allowing the lightest contact with her leg, a gesture he had previously reserved for Jack and Mark. "Well?" Caroline breathed, clearly moved by the Bobcat's acceptance. "Hello there. He has good instincts about people," Jack found himself saying. "Always has." Their eyes met over River's tawny head, and something passed between them. Not reconciliation exactly, but perhaps understanding. A recognition that though their paths had diverged, the things that had initially drawn them together remained valid and true. As the evening deepened into night, practical concerns asserted themselves. The cabin, designed for Jack's solitary existence with occasional accommodation for Mark, was not equipped for an additional overnight guest. The impending departure of the conservation officers meant that driving back to town in the dark over snow-covered roads was inadvisable at best. "I can sleep in my car," Caroline suggested. "It wouldn't be the first time I've done field work camping." "Don't be ridiculous," Jack replied before Mark could protest. "You'll take my bed. I'll use the floor by the fire." "Dad, I can take the floor," Mark offered. "You should. It's settled," Jack interrupted firmly. "I sleep there half the time anyway, keeping an eye on our friend here." He nodded toward River, who had returned to his customary spot on the hearth rug. Caroline acquiesced with a grace that reminded Jack of their early years together, when compromise had come more easily to both of them. "Thank you," she said simply. "It's very kind." The three of them prepared for sleep, moving around each other in the confined space with careful consideration. Jack made up a comfortable pallet near the fire, using spare blankets and his old sleeping bag. Mark retired to the small guest area, while Caroline took Jack's bedroom, the door left partially open in deference to the cabin's heating needs. As silence settled over the cabin, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and River's occasional contented sigh, Jack found himself unexpectedly at peace. The day had brought surprises: Caroline's appearance, the easy interaction between them all, the sense of family that had reasserted itself despite years of separation. It wasn't a return to the past, but rather something new and undefined, shaped by all that had happened in the intervening years. River shifted in his sleep, one paw extending to rest lightly against Jack's arm. The simple contact carried its own meaning: trust, acceptance, companionship freely given. Jack closed his eyes, gratitude washing through him for this most unexpected of Christmas gifts. Not just the reunion with Caroline, but the broader healing that River's presence had somehow catalyzed in all their lives. Morning arrived with gentle insistence. Pale winter sunlight filtering through frost-edged windows, the fire burned down to glowing embers, River already alert and watching the door with anticipatory focus. Jack rose quietly, careful not to disturb the others as he added wood to the stove and began preparing coffee. Caroline emerged from the bedroom as the rich aroma filled the cabin, her hair tousled from sleep, but her eyes clear and alert. "That," she said appreciatively, nodding toward the coffee pot, "smells promising." "Told you my coffee skills had improved," Jack replied with a hint of a smile. They moved around each other with careful courtesy, preparing a simple breakfast while Mark continued to sleep. River observed their interaction with characteristic attention, occasionally shifting position to maintain optimal viewing of both humans. "He really does watch everything," Caroline noted, keeping her voice low. "Cataloging behaviors, learning patterns." Jack nodded. "Smart as anything I've ever encountered in these woods. Makes you wonder how much we've underestimated what wild creatures understand." "It's a growing field of study," Caroline agreed. animal cognition, emotional capacity, social structures beyond simple dominance hierarchies. The data is increasingly suggesting that the gap between human and animal consciousness may be narrower than we've traditionally believed. Doesn't surprise me, Jack said, flipping pancakes with practiced ease. Spend enough time watching them in their natural environment. You start to see the complexity. That was always your gift, Caroline observed. Seeing what the rest of us missed because we were too busy categorizing and quantifying. The compliment, offered without qualification or irony, caught Jack by surprise. During the difficult later years of their marriage, his intuitive approach to understanding wildlife had often been a point of contention. Caroline valuing empirical evidence and peer-reviewed research over what she had sometimes dismissed as woodsman's folklore. We each saw different parts of the same picture, he acknowledged, the words an olive branch of sorts. Both valuable in their way. Caroline's smile was warm, appreciative of the gesture. Yes, that's exactly right. Mark joined them shortly thereafter, his enthusiasm for the day evident despite the early hour. As they ate breakfast, conversation turned to the practical matter of Caroline's departure. She needed to return to Chicago that day to prepare for an academic conference, which meant leaving by mid-morning to ensure arriving before dark. "I'll come back, though," she promised Mark. "When you start your official research period. Maybe help with some of the documentation, if that's okay with both of you." "That would be great," Mark exclaimed, looking to his father for confirmation. Jack nodded, finding that the prospect of Caroline's future visits didn't trigger the anxiety or resistance he might have expected. "More eyes on the project couldn't hurt," he agreed. "And you always were better with the technical writing parts." After breakfast, they packed Caroline's car with her remaining belongings, the process taking on the bittersweet quality of all departures. River watched from the porch, the new collar gleaming against his fur in the morning light, his posture alert but relaxed, a guardian observing rather than a wild thing poised for flight. When everything was ready, Caroline turned to Jack, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for sharing your Christmas with me, for being welcoming when you had every right not to be." "Family is family," Jack replied simply. "Some things don't change, even when everything else does." She nodded, understanding the depth beneath his sparse words. "I'm glad Mark has you, has this place. It grounds him in something real, something beyond the academic world we both inhabit." "He is both of us," Jack corrected gently. "Different things to offer. He needs both." Caroline's eyes brightened with unexpected emotion. "Yes," she agreed softly. "He does." Their goodbye was brief but genuine, a quick embrace that acknowledged their shared history without dwelling on past difficulties. Mark's farewell to his mother was more demonstrative, full of promises about phone calls and future visits. River observed it all from a respectful distance, yellow-green eyes missing nothing of the human interactions unfolding before him. As Caroline's car disappeared down the access road, Jack felt Mark's hand on his shoulder, a man's gesture of solidarity rather than a boy's need for comfort. "That went well," Mark said, his tone somewhere between statement and question. "Better than I would have expected," Jack agreed. They turned back toward the cabin, where River waited on the porch, his posture suggesting both welcome and expectation. The day stretched before them, their last together before Mark's return to university. There were traps to check, firewood to split, plans to finalize for Mark's return in the spring. Ordinary tasks made extraordinary by the shared doing of them. Later that evening, as dusk gathered around the cabin, Jack found himself standing at the edge of the clearing, watching as Mark and River explored the perimeter in the failing light. His son moved with increasing confidence through the winter landscape, his city-bred caution giving way to a woodsman's awareness with each passing day. River kept pace alongside, occasionally demonstrating proper stalking technique or alerting Mark to signs Jack was certain his son would otherwise have missed. The sight stirred something profound in Jack's chest, pride, certainly, but also hope. Hope that the forest that had shaped his own life might continue to influence his sons, might provide the same solace and wisdom it had offered him through difficult years. Hope that the unlikely bond formed with a wild creature might expand to encompass not just survival, but a deeper understanding of connection itself. Mark had been right about River being a bridge. The Bobcat had connected them in ways Jack hadn't anticipated, father to son, humans to wilderness, past to future. In saving the half-frozen creature from certain death, Jack had unwittingly created something new, a space where different worlds could meet and find common ground. River looked up then, catching Jack's gaze across the clearing. The Bobcat's yellow-green eyes, once alien and inscrutable, now held a familiar awareness that Jack had come to treasure. Without breaking that connection, River leaned slightly against Mark's leg, a gesture that perfectly captured the essence of what had developed between them all. Jack smiled, accepting the gift for what it was. Unexpected, unearned, and all the more precious for being freely given. Tomorrow would bring departures and returns, challenges and possibilities. But for now, in this moment, everything that mattered was here before him. His son, the forest, and the remarkable creature who had somehow brought it all together. As darkness settled fully over the winter landscape, Jack turned toward the warm light spilling from the cabin windows. Behind him, he heard Mark's laugh and River's answering chirp, different voices speaking the same language of connection and belonging. "Coming, Dad," Mark called. "Right behind you." Jack replied and stepped forward to join them.